On the morning of October 13th, 1841, 23 guests witnessed what Hartford's upper society would later call the most shocking wedding ceremony in Connecticut's history. Within minutes of taking her first sip of ceremonial wine, 19-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan collapsed at the altar of Trinity Episcopal Church, her wedding dress pooling around her convulsing body as white foam escaped her lips. The bride's final words, heard clearly by the front pew, were a desperate whisper. "The wine, it burns." What authorities discovered 3 days later would expose a calculated murder so cold-blooded that the Hartford Courant refused to print the full details, fearing public outrage. The killer sat among the wedding guests, watching every agonizing moment with the composure of someone who had planned each detail for months. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Pemberton and the O'Sullivan family tragedy, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which state or city you're listening from. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten American mysteries to light. The truth behind what happened that autumn morning reveals a web of social hatred, financial desperation, and maternal obsession that would reshape Hartford's elite society forever. Hartford in 1841 stood at the crossroads of old New England tradition and industrial progress. The Connecticut River carried steamboats loaded with goods from New York, while new factories sprouted along its banks, their smokestacks competing with church spires for dominance of the skyline. The city's population had swelled to nearly 13,000 souls, with Irish immigrants flooding in to work the mills and railroads that promised prosperity to anyone willing to labor from dawn to dusk. Among Hartford's established families, none commanded more respect than the Pembertons. Eleanor Pemberton, 48 years old and widowed for 6 years, ruled over one of the city's most prominent households from her federal-style mansion on Prospect Street. The 3-story brick home, with its perfectly manicured gardens and wrought-iron fencing, served as a symbol of everything the old Connecticut elite represented: stability, tradition, and unquestionable social superiority. Eleanor had not been born into wealth. The daughter of a modestly successful Hartford merchant, she had married above her station when she wed Jonathan Pemberton in 1815. Jonathan, heir to a shipping fortune built during the War of 1812, had chosen Eleanor for her beauty and sharp intelligence rather than her pedigree. Their marriage had been a love match that scandalized some members of Hartford society, but Jonathan's success in expanding the family business into insurance and manufacturing had silenced most critics. Their only child, William, had been born in 1817 after 3 miscarriages that left Eleanor convinced he was a miracle. She devoted herself entirely to his upbringing, ensuring he received the finest education available. William attended Yale College, where he studied law and literature, returning to Hartford in 1839 to join his father's business interests. Tall and scholarly, with his father's dark hair and his mother's penetrating grey eyes, William Pemberton was considered one of Hartford's most eligible bachelors. When Jonathan died suddenly of apoplexy in 1835, Eleanor found herself in control of an estate worth approximately $40,000, a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women in Connecticut. She managed the family's investments with an iron hand, determined to preserve not only their wealth, but their social position. The Pemberton name opened doors throughout New England, and Eleanor intended to keep it that way. The Irish migration to Hartford had accelerated throughout the 1830s, driven by poverty and crop failures in Ireland. These newcomers settled in the area near the railroad depot in cramped tenements that lacked proper sanitation. They worked for wages that established residents considered insulting. Yet their willingness to labor for so little drove down costs for factory owners and created resentment among American-born workers. Eleanor observed these changes with growing alarm. At Ladies' Aid Society meetings, she listened to complaints about Irish servants who allegedly stole from their employers, about Irish children who fought with proper American youngsters, about Irish families who crowded 10 people into spaces meant for 4. The established families of Hartford began to speak of the Irish problem in hushed tones, wondering aloud whether these Catholic foreigners could ever truly become Americans. Into this atmosphere of social tension came the O'Sullivan family in late 1839. Patrick O'Sullivan, a widower of 38, had brought his 4 children to Hartford after hearing of work opportunities in the city's expanding mills. His eldest daughter, Bridget, was 17 when they arrived, a striking young woman with auburn hair and emerald eyes that seemed to capture light, even in Hartford's grey winter months. Patrick found work as a supervisor at Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, where his experience with machinery in Dublin's textile mills proved valuable. The salary allowed him to rent a small but respectable house on Front Street, closer to Hartford Centre than most Irish families could afford. Bridget took a position as a seamstress in one of the better dress shops on State Street, where her skill with delicate fabrics and her ability to speak without a heavy brogue made her popular with customers. It was at Wadsworth Athenaeum's public lecture series that Bridget first encountered William Pemberton. The lecture, delivered by a visiting professor from Harvard on the topic of American literature, had drawn Hartford's intellectual elite. Bridget attended because her employer, Mrs. Catherine Hendricks, had encouraged her Irish employees to better themselves through education and culture. William noticed her immediately. Seated in the back section reserved for working people, Bridget listened with an intensity that impressed him. When the lecturer opened the floor for questions, she raised her hand to ask about the influence of Irish poetry on American writers, a question so thoughtful and well articulated that several people turned to look at her with surprise. After the lecture, William approached her as she gathered her cloak. "That was an excellent question about Irish literary influence," he said, removing his hat. "I'm William Pemberton. I don't believe we've been introduced." Bridget's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Bridget O'Sullivan, Mr. Pemberton. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." They walked together towards State Street, talking about books and ideas with an ease that surprised them both. William learned that despite her limited formal education, Bridget had read voraciously, everything from Shakespeare to contemporary American authors. She had borrowed books from a kind priest in Dublin and continued reading whatever she could obtain in Hartford's lending libraries. When they reached the corner where their paths diverged, William hesitated. "Miss O'Sullivan, I wonder, would you care to attend next week's lecture? It's to be about American history, and I suspect you might find it interesting." Bridget's smile transformed her entire face. "I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Pemberton." Their courtship began quietly, carefully. William understood the social implications of his interest in an Irish working girl, but Bridget's intelligence and grace convinced him that such considerations were petty and unworthy. They met for walks along the Connecticut River, attended lectures and cultural events, and discovered a compatibility that transcended their different backgrounds. Eleanor remained unaware of these developments for nearly 6 months. William had always been discreet about his personal affairs, and she assumed his frequent absences from home reflected his dedication to business matters or social obligations with young men of his own class. The revelation came on a humid afternoon in July 1840. Eleanor had decided to surprise William with a visit to his office at the Pemberton Building on State Street, bringing him cold lemonade and news of an invitation to the governor's summer reception. As she climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, she heard voices from behind his office door, William's familiar baritone and a woman's voice she didn't recognize. "My mother will never accept this," William was saying, "but I don't care about her approval anymore, Bridget. I love you, and that's what matters." Eleanor froze on the landing, her hand gripping the lemonade pitcher so tightly her knuckles went white. "Your family's position in society," the woman replied, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "I don't want to be the cause of trouble between you and your mother, William. She sacrificed so much for you." "You don't understand," William said firmly. "She's controlled every aspect of my life since Father died, whom I should marry, where I should live, how I should spend my time. I'm 23 years old, and I've never made a single important decision without her approval. That ends now." Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it through the door. "When will you tell her about us?" the woman asked. Soon, very soon. I want you to meet her properly as my intended bride. She'll see what I see in you, your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. She'll have to accept that I've chosen the woman I want to spend my life with. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor sent Eleanor fleeing down the stairs, abandoning the lemonade on the landing. She reached her carriage in a state of near panic, ordering her driver to take her home immediately. During the brief ride to Prospect Street, her shock gave way to a rage so pure and consuming that she felt physically ill. An Irish girl, her William, heir to the Pemberton fortune and name, was planning to marry an Irish immigrant. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed and schemed to preserve, would be destroyed by this. This nobody who had probably seduced her innocent son with calculated charm. That evening, William came home for dinner, appearing more cheerful than he had in months. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the way he hummed under his breath while carving the roast, the satisfied smile that played at the corners of his mouth. She wanted to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation. But her years of social maneuvering had taught her patience. She needed information before she could act effectively. "You seem in excellent spirits tonight, William," she said, keeping her voice light. "Do I? Well, I suppose I am. I've been thinking about making some changes in my life, important changes." "Oh? What sort of changes?" William set down his fork and looked directly at her. "Mother, I've met someone, a young woman of exceptional character and intelligence. I believe she might be the person I want to marry." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "How wonderful, dear. Anyone I know?" "No, but I'm eager for you to meet her. Her name is Bridget O'Sullivan, and she's—" He paused as if gathering courage. "She's from Ireland originally. Her family came to Hartford 2 years ago." The water glass slipped from Eleanor's fingers, shattering against her plate. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, rising to ring for the servants. "You said O'Sullivan? An Irish family?" "Yes. Her father works at Colt's factory, and she's employed at Mrs. Hendricks's dress shop." "Mother, I know what you're thinking, but—" "I'm not thinking anything, William," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carefully controlled. "I'm simply surprised. You've never mentioned this young woman before." "I wanted to be certain of my feelings before discussing her with you, but I am certain now. I love her, Mother, and I intend to ask for her hand in marriage." Eleanor spent the remainder of the evening in her private sitting room, pacing the Persian carpet until she wore a visible path in the pattern. William's words echoed in her mind. He loved this Irish girl, intended to marry her. The implications struck her like physical blows. Marriage to an Irish immigrant would destroy William's social standing. The best families in Hartford would close their doors to him. His children would carry the stigma of their mixed heritage, neither fully accepted by the established elite nor welcomed by the Irish community that would see them as traitors to their origins. More immediately threatening was the financial risk. If William married this girl, Eleanor would lose all influence over family affairs. As his wife, the Irish woman would have legal rights to the Pemberton fortune. She might convince William to support her extended family, to make donations to Catholic causes, to invest in schemes that benefited immigrants at the expense of established American interests. Eleanor had not clawed her way from merchant-class origins to the pinnacle of Hartford society only to watch an Irish peasant destroy everything she had built. She would not allow her family's wealth to be squandered on Catholic churches and Irish relatives. She would not see the Pemberton name dragged through the mud by association with foreign poverty and superstition. Over the following weeks, Eleanor conducted a careful investigation of the O'Sullivan family. She learned that Patrick O'Sullivan was considered a reliable worker, but had been involved in labor discussions that some viewed as potentially subversive. Bridget was well regarded by her employer and customers, but several society matrons whispered about the impropriety of an Irish girl putting on airs above her station. Eleanor also discovered that the O'Sullivans attended Mass at Holy Trinity Church, the Catholic institution that many Protestant Hartford residents viewed with suspicion and distrust. The thought of her grandchildren being raised as Catholics, owing allegiance to a foreign pope, filled her with horror. As summer turned to autumn, William's relationship with Bridget deepened. He brought her to a few public events, introducing her to his friends with obvious pride and affection. Eleanor watched from a distance as Hartford society reacted with polite surprise that quickly gave way to whispered speculation. The breaking point came in early September when William announced his intention to formally propose. "I've spoken with Mr. O'Sullivan," he told his mother over breakfast. "He's given his permission for me to ask for Bridget's hand. I plan to propose this evening." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "William, I must ask you to reconsider this decision." "Mother, please, let me finish. I've said nothing about this association because I hoped it would run its natural course. But you're talking about marriage now, about permanent commitments that will affect not just your life but the future of our family." William's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that marriage is about more than personal feelings. It's about social compatibility, shared values, common backgrounds. This young woman may be perfectly pleasant, but she comes from a world entirely different from ours. The differences that seem charming now will become sources of conflict later. Her background doesn't matter to me. It should matter. It will matter to your children, who will struggle to find their place in society. It will matter to your business associates, who expect their partners to maintain certain standards. It will matter to everyone we know." William stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm disappointed in you, Mother. I expected better from someone who married for love herself. Your father and I came from similar circumstances. We understood each other's expectations and obligations. This situation is entirely different. The only difference is your prejudice against the Irish." Eleanor's mask of composure finally slipped. "It's not prejudice, William. It's reality. These people are not like us. They have different loyalties, different values, different priorities. This girl will change you, and not for the better. This conversation is over," William said coldly. "I'm going to propose to Bridget tonight, with or without your blessing." After he left, Eleanor sat alone in the dining room for nearly an hour, staring at her untouched breakfast. The die was cast. William would not be dissuaded by arguments or threats. He was going to marry this Irish girl, and when he did, Eleanor's control over the family fortune and legacy would end forever, unless she took action to prevent it. The engagement of William Pemberton to Bridget O'Sullivan was announced in the Hartford Courant on September 15, 1840. The brief notice, placed in the society section, generated more discussion than any social news in recent memory. At tea parties and gentlemen's clubs throughout the city, people debated whether William had lost his senses or simply succumbed to Irish seduction. Eleanor maintained a facade of gracious acceptance while privately seething. She attended social functions where well-meaning friends offered congratulations mixed with barely concealed sympathy. "How progressive of William," they would say, their voices carrying undertones of scandal. "I'm sure the girl is quite suitable." The worst moment came at a Ladies' Aid Society meeting where Mrs. Harrison Fitzgerald, whose own Irish ancestry was conveniently forgotten by Hartford society, made a pointed comment about the importance of maintaining proper standards in marriage. "Of course, we must be charitable to these immigrant families," she said, glancing meaningfully at Eleanor. "But there are appropriate boundaries that shouldn't be crossed." Eleanor smiled tightly and changed the subject, but the humiliation burned in her chest like acid. She was being pitied, patronized by women who had once deferred to her social position. The Pemberton name, which had opened every door in Connecticut, was becoming a source of whispered gossip and snide commentary. During this period, Eleanor began to study Bridget O'Sullivan with the intensity of a military strategist examining an enemy position. She attended public events where the couple appeared, watching how Bridget moved, spoke, and interacted with Hartford's elite. What she observed only deepened her alarm. Bridget was not the simple Irish peasant Eleanor had hoped to find. The young woman possessed a natural elegance that could not be taught, an intelligence that shone in her conversations, and a genuine warmth that drew people to her. Even Eleanor's harshest critics among the society matrons admitted that the O'Sullivan girl had remarkable poise for someone of her background. More troubling was the obvious depth of William's devotion. He looked at Bridget with an adoration Eleanor had never seen from him before. When they walked together, he unconsciously matched his longer stride to hers. When she spoke, he listened with complete attention. When others made subtle social slights, he defended her with a fierce protectiveness that reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of how Jonathan had once defended her against similar treatment. The wedding was scheduled for October 13th. William had wanted a small ceremony, but Bridget insisted on inviting both families and their closest friends. "I want everyone we care about to witness our vows," she told him. "I don't want anyone to think we're ashamed of our marriage or trying to hide it." Eleanor realized that a public wedding would make her humiliation complete. Every prominent family in Hartford would attend, if only to satisfy their curiosity about the Irish bride. The ceremony would be discussed and dissected for months, cementing the Pemberton names association with social degradation. As September passed into October, Eleanor's desperation grew. She considered various strategies for disrupting the wedding plans. She could claim sudden illness, requiring William to postpone the ceremony to care for her. She could attempt to bribe Patrick O'Sullivan to withdraw his consent. She could even threaten to disinherit William entirely. But each option carried unacceptable risks. William might proceed with the wedding regardless of her illness or threats. Bribing the father could backfire spectacularly if he revealed her attempt to the wider community. And disinheriting William would mean losing control over him permanently, while ensuring that her fortune eventually passed to strangers. The solution came to Eleanor during a sleepless night in early October. She was reviewing her late husband's papers, searching for some legal mechanism that might give her continued control over the family assets, when she discovered Jonathan's correspondence with a business associate in New York who dealt in rare chemicals for industrial purposes. Among the letters was a detailed discussion of various compounds used in manufacturing processes, including their effects on human health when handled improperly. One letter specifically mentioned arsenic oxide, commonly used in textile production and available through legitimate commercial channels. Jonathan had been investigating its use in a proposed fabric treatment process, but had ultimately decided against the investment due to safety concerns. The letter included precise information about the compound's properties. Its appearance, white crystalline powder that dissolved easily in liquids. Its taste, virtually undetectable when mixed with strong flavors, and its effects, rapid onset of symptoms that mimicked various common ailments. Most importantly, the correspondent noted that arsenic oxide was difficult to detect without sophisticated chemical analysis, procedures that were rarely performed in cases of sudden illness. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart racing as the implications became clear. Here was a means of preventing William's marriage that would appear entirely natural, tragic, but unavoidable. A sudden illness striking the bride during the wedding ceremony would be shocking but not unprecedented. Young women sometimes succumbed to the excitement and stress of their wedding day, especially those from lower social classes who might be overwhelmed by the grandeur of the occasion. The plan crystallized with shocking clarity. Eleanor would need to obtain arsenic oxide through her late husband's business contacts, claiming she was continuing his investigation into industrial applications. She would need to find an opportunity to administer it during the wedding ceremony, when all attention was focused on the bride and groom, and she would need to ensure that her own behavior appeared completely natural, that of a concerned mother-in-law witnessing a tragedy. On October 8th, 5 days before the wedding, Eleanor visited the offices of Hartwell Chemical Supply in New York City. She took the train early in the morning, dressed in her most respectable traveling clothes and carrying Jonathan's business correspondence as credentials. Mr. Hartwell, a thin man with nervous hands and wire-rimmed spectacles, remembered Jonathan favorably. "A cautious businessman," he told Eleanor. always concerned about safety and proper procedures. "How may I assist you, Mrs. Pemberton?" Eleanor explained that she was settling her late husband's affairs and wanted to complete his investigation into textile treatment processes. She produced Jonathan's letters and spoke knowledgeably about the proposed applications, having spent days studying the technical details. "Arsenic oxide, yes," Hartwell said, consulting his records. "Your husband was interested in its use for fabric preservation. Are you planning to proceed with the investment?" "I'm still evaluating the commercial potential," Eleanor replied smoothly. "But I'd like to conduct some preliminary tests to better understand the compound's properties." "Could you provide a small sample for experimental purposes?" Hartwell nodded and disappeared into his storeroom, returning with a glass vial containing perhaps 2 ounces of white powder. "This should be sufficient for your testing purposes. Please observe all safety precautions. The compound is highly toxic if ingested or inhaled." Eleanor paid in cash and carefully placed the vial in her reticule. During the train ride back to Hartford, she held her purse close to her body, acutely aware of its deadly contents. She felt no guilt, only a grim satisfaction that she had taken decisive action to protect her family's future. The remaining days passed in a blur of wedding preparations. Bridget had engaged Eleanor's help in planning the reception, a gesture of goodwill that Eleanor found simultaneously touching and infuriating. The young woman clearly hoped to win her future mother-in-law's approval through inclusive gestures and respectful attention. "I want you to feel that this is your celebration too, Mrs. Pemberton," Bridget said, as they reviewed the menu for the wedding breakfast. "William speaks of you with such love and respect. I hope that someday you might feel the same affection for me." Eleanor managed to smile and nod appropriately, all while calculating exactly how much arsenic oxide would be required to ensure a swift but apparently natural death. Too little might cause illness without achieving her goal. Too much might create obvious symptoms that would raise suspicions. Based on Jonathan's correspondence and her own research in medical texts borrowed from Hartford's library, Eleanor determined that approximately 1/2 teaspoon of the powder, dissolved in wine, would be sufficient. The symptoms would begin within minutes and progress rapidly, mimicking the effects of extreme excitement or heart failure. On the morning of October 13th, Eleanor awoke before dawn with a clarity of purpose she had not felt in months. Every detail of the plan had been rehearsed in her mind dozens of times. She knew exactly when and how she would act, and the knowledge filled her with grim determination. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock at Trinity Episcopal Church, followed by a reception at the Pemberton Mansion. Eleanor had volunteered to oversee the refreshment preparations, a responsibility that would give her complete access to the ceremonial wine that would be served to the bride and groom during the blessing. She dressed carefully in her finest dark blue silk gown, adding the pearl necklace Jonathan had given her on their own wedding day. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman of dignified composure, every inch the respected Hartford matron attending her son's wedding. No one looking at her would suspect the deadly purpose that drove every measured movement. The arsenic oxide was hidden in a small silk sachet sewn into the inner pocket of her dress. The powder had been carefully measured and prepared the night before, ready to be dissolved in wine at the crucial moment. Eleanor had practiced the motion dozens of times, ensuring she could empty the sachet's contents quickly and naturally while appearing to adjust the wine service. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor arrived at Trinity Church to supervise the final preparations. The Gothic Revival building, with its soaring spire and stained glass windows, had been decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons in shades of gold and burgundy. Bridget's limited budget had not allowed for elaborate decorations, but the simple arrangements possessed an understated elegance that even Eleanor grudgingly admired. Father Matthews, the elderly Episcopal priest who would officiate, greeted Eleanor with respectful warmth. "Mrs. Pemberton, how lovely to see you. I understand you've been instrumental in organizing today's celebration." "It's my pleasure, Father," Eleanor replied smoothly. "This is such a joyous occasion for our family." She moved efficiently through the church, checking flower arrangements and supervising the placement of chairs for the reception. Her true focus, however, was on the communion table where the ceremonial wine would be placed. The heavy silver chalice, a wedding gift from Eleanor to the couple, sat ready for the blessing that would follow the exchange of vows. The wine itself was stored in the church vestry, along with the other refreshments that would be served after the ceremony. Eleanor had specifically requested that a bottle of their finest French vintage be opened for the occasion, explaining to Father Matthews that she wanted William and Bridget to begin their marriage with the best of everything. At 10:30, the first guests began arriving. Eleanor positioned herself near the church entrance, greeting each arrival with perfect social grace. She watched Patrick O'Sullivan escort his 3 younger children to their seats, noting how the man had clearly spent considerable money on new clothes for the occasion. His obvious pride in his daughter's marriage to a Pemberton stirred Eleanor's anger afresh. Members of Hartford's elite arrived in elegant carriages, their expressions carefully neutral as they took in the mix of social classes represented among the guests. Eleanor observed their subtle reactions, the way they nodded politely to the Irish families while maintaining careful distance. The social dynamics she had predicted were already playing out exactly as expected. William arrived at 10:45, accompanied by his friend Charles Whitman, who was serving as best man. Eleanor felt a pang of genuine love as she watched her son adjust his cravat nervously and speak in low tones with Father Matthews about the ceremony's progression. He looked handsome and happy, blissfully unaware that his mother was about to save him from the greatest mistake of his life. At precisely 11 o'clock, the church bells began to toll, and Bridget appeared at the rear of the nave. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat despite herself. The young woman was genuinely beautiful, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant style that complemented the simple but perfectly fitted white gown she had sewn herself. She carried a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, and her face glowed with happiness that seemed to illuminate the entire church. Patrick O'Sullivan walked proudly beside his daughter, his hand resting gently on her arm. As they processed down the aisle, Eleanor noticed how many of the guests smiled involuntarily at the sight of the radiant bride. Even some of Hartford's most socially rigid matrons appeared touched by Bridget's obvious joy and dignity. The ceremony proceeded with traditional Episcopal solemnity. Father Matthews spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, the importance of mutual respect and devotion, and the blessings that awaited couples who built their union on firm spiritual foundations. William and Bridget exchanged vows in clear, confident voices, their eyes never leaving each other's faces. Eleanor watched from the front pew, her hand resting over the hidden sachet of poison. Soon, she told herself. Very soon, this travesty would be over, and William would be free to make a proper marriage with someone of his own class and background. Following the exchange of rings, Father Matthews moved to the communion table to begin the blessing of the wine. This was Eleanor's moment. She rose from her seat with practiced grace and approached the altar, ostensibly to assist with the ceremonial service as mother of the groom. "Allow me to help prepare the wine, Father," she said quietly, moving to stand beside the silver chalice. The priest nodded appreciatively and turned to address the congregation about the significance of sharing wine as a symbol of the couple's new union. While he spoke, Eleanor's fingers found the sachet in her dress pocket. With movements perfected through countless rehearsals, she emptied the white powder into the chalice and used a silver spoon to stir it gently into the deep red wine. The arsenic oxide dissolved completely, leaving no trace of its presence. The wine maintained its rich color and would taste no different than before, at least not to someone drinking it in the emotional excitement of their wedding day. Father Matthews